Good afternoon, Professor Myerson, the President of the University, Associate Professor Sawani Thairungrod, Mr. Uwe Moraves, Founding Chairman of the International Peace Foundation, honorable guests, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Dusani Kesawayut. From School of Economics. I will be your MC for today's afternoon event. On behalf of the University of the Thai Chamber of Commerce and the International Peace Foundation, I'm greatly honored to welcome you to the 4th ASEAN event series, Bridges Dialogue Toward a Culture of Peace. It is our great pleasure and privilege to have Professor Roger Myerson with us today. Professor Myerson will give us the speech on leadership, democracy, and local government. To mark the formal opening of the event in Thailand, and also we have this event carry on in Vietnam for this year. Professor Myerson is a 2007 Nobel laureate for economics, who has made seminal contributions to the field of economics and political science. His works on mechanism design and game theory play a central role in many areas of our life. For example, efficient trading mechanism, regulation scheme, auction processes, and voting procedures. Professor Myerson has also extended his contribution to political science. His works using economic analysis of political institutions help us to understand how political incentives can be affected by different electoral systems and constitutional structures. These work also help us to better understand the process of democratization. Currently, Professor Myerson is a Glenn A. Lloyd Distinguished Service Professor of Economics at the University of Chicago. Now, I would like to invite Assistant President for Research of the University, Dr. Virachat Gilentong, to give a welcome remark.
Thank you. Professor Roger Myerson, UTCC executives, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the University of the Thai Chamber of Commerce, may I welcome all of you to our special lecture co-organized by the University of the Thai Chamber of Commerce and the International Peace Foundation. UTCC has already organized 19 series of special lectures, most of them through the cooperations with International Peace Foundation, to hold special lectures from Nobel laureates in economics. In the past, UTCC has had the honor of many Nobel laureates as follows: Professor James Heckman, 2000 Nobel laureate; Professor Robert A. Mundell, 1999 Nobel laureate; Professor Finn Kitland, 2004 Nobel laureate; Professor Robert Engel, 2003 Nobel laureate; Professor Eric Maskin, 2007 Nobel laureate, as well as Mr. James Wolfson, former president of the World Bank. May I thank Professor Roger Myerson, Mr. Uwe Moraves, Chairman of the International Peace Foundation, honorary guests, participants, and audience. I truly believe this lecture will provide a good forum, motivation, and inspiration for interesting people and public. All through this lecture, I can picture all of you as a caravan of peacemakers moving along the road to equality and harmony world. Thank you.
Next, I would like to invite Mr. Uwe Moraves, Founding Chairman of the International Peace Foundation, to open the event.
Sawadee Krap, and welcome to the fourth ASEAN event series, Bridges, Dialogues Towards a Culture of Peace. Bridges is facilitated by the International Peace Foundation, a non-political and non-religious foundation under the common patronage of 21 Nobel Peace Prize laureates based in Vienna. The events are hosted in cooperation with various local partners, including some of the country's main universities. And I would like to thank the University of the Thai Chamber of Commerce and its president, Professor Sawani Thairongroch, for hosting our event today. Starting in November this year, Bridges will now be continuously held in Thailand and Vietnam until March 2013, involving the participation of Nobel laureates for peace, physics, chemistry, medicine and economics, as well as with other eminent keynote speakers, including the former president of the European Commission, Romano Prodi. The fourth ASEAN series of Bridges follows the series of 450 events, which the International Peace Foundation has already hosted in Thailand, the Philippines, Malaysia and Cambodia since November 2003, as an independent contribution to the Decade for Culture of Peace and Nonviolence, which was initiated by the United Nations General Assembly. The pluralistic program of Bridges highlights the International Peace Foundation's intercultural and interdisciplinary approach towards peace. The foundation does not take sides, but acts as a mediator by creating an independent platform for dialogue where representatives of science, politics, economy, culture, religion, the media, and youth can meet, share their viewpoints, listen to each other, and find mutual ways of understanding and cooperation. Therefore, the foundation itself is a bridge and a facilitator between different language groups in our divided societies, where politicians speak another language than artists, and business and religious leaders another one than scientists. In a highly interdependent world, problems cannot be solved by either one of these language groups only, but by working together. After the success of its Bridges programs in Thailand, the Philippines, Malaysia, and Cambodia, the International Peace Foundation has been invited by other ASEAN countries to build further bridges towards peace and international cooperation by expanding its program in Southeast Asia to stimulate the intellectual, scientific, and cultural exchange here in the region. The fourth ASEAN Bridges series therefore continuously takes place in Thailand and Vietnam from November until March, comprising events with Nobel laureates from all fields. The Nobel laureates will visit the region not all at once, but separately to conduct public lectures, seminars, workshops, and dialogues hosted by local institutions during a continued period of 5 months. The aim of Bridges is to facilitate and strengthen dialogue and communication between societies in Southeast Asia with their multiple cultures and faiths, as well as with people in other parts of the world, to promote understanding and trust. The events aim at building bridges with local universities and other institutions in Southeast Asia to establish long-term relationships with Nobel laureates in all fields, which may result in common research programs and other forms of collaboration. By enhancing science, technology, and education as a basis for peace and development, the events may lead to a better cooperation for the advancement of peace, freedom, and security in the region, with the active involvement of the young generation, ASEAN's key to the future. This is why Bridges is not held and designed as a one-time event, but as a continuing process of synergies to make the series of events a sustainable success for Thailand, for Vietnam, and for ASEAN as a whole. I am grateful to the University of the Thai Chamber of Commerce for our long cooperation, as well as to our other partners and sponsors who have enabled us to make the idea of Bridges a reality. I would like to say thank you for everyone present today for taking part in this program. May it help us to facilitate a new culture of peace through dialogue, transcending its definition as merely the absence of war or armed conflict, into a new understanding what the basis for peace is: education. In this spirit, we welcome today the 2007 Nobel laureate for economics, Professor Roger Myerson, who has agreed to come to Thailand to support the events. We all look forward to his keynote speech and to his important contribution to build bridges. Welcome, Professor Myerson.
It's a privilege to be here at the University of the Thai Chamber of Commerce to be your guest of the International Peace Foundation. Good. I was hoping that there are some important supporters of the International Peace Foundation in this visit whose names are now being covered, but I'm glad to have the slides down if you don't mind. What I'd like to, I want to talk about, for this event, I wanted to talk about the most important questions that I thought I could raise and questions on which I think I can offer some insights, or at least call for a different perspective, but questions that are very much open and on which I hope we'll have some dialogue. I think the experiences of this country, which I don't know enough about, this being my first visit, I think shed a lot of light on the questions of what makes a successful society, what are the keys to economic development and social development. Adam Smith founded modern economics with a book on the wealth of nations, and that is a great question. What is the source of the great differences in the wealth of nations that we have observed? An economic theorist formulates logical models to focus on these great questions. The models that we formulate, if they're going to give us insights, have to be consistent with data and with the broad patterns of world history. I'm not going to talk, this is a non-technical lecture, so I'm not going to talk about any specific models in detail. I want to share with you insights that depend on my attempt to ask the question, what has been the secret for success of different countries in the world? I certainly am going to focus a lot on what I think are the unappreciated aspects of the English system and the American political system that had something to do with the early rise of England to the Industrial Revolution and the great success of America in the world. The great development of Asia during our time is an extraordinarily important process, but what I want to do is try to sketch to you some of the elements that I think are particularly important in understanding the basic conditions for successful democratic development, as a way of understanding something of the great differences in wealth of nations. And I'm going to begin from a perspective, I'm an economist, but my understanding of economic theory is embedded in social science more generally. And so I do believe, and I do want to start with a view, that great differences in the wealth of nations depend on political foundations. So to understand why rich countries are rich, you have to understand something about the foundations of their legal and political systems. And so to understand economic development, we need to understand something about how effective states are built by political leaders. And that's what politicians do, is they build our nations. They build governments. I think one of the key insights that I want to focus on is that investment is protected locally, but trade has to be protected nationally. And so development depends on both local and national politics. So the question I want to raise, what I think the perspective I want to offer is to try to say, to understand how any country operates, we need to think not just about how its presidents or prime ministers are chosen, but to understand how its structures of local leadership interact with structures of national leadership. So let me just say a few words about how I think about politics as an economist. We have to recognize that the state is a network of agents who enforce laws and sustain property rights. I am part of a school of, I'm a game theorist, but we work in the last 30 years, there's been a development of the study of what we call information economics and agency theory in economics. This is about understanding transactions where people have difficulty trusting each other because they have different information, or because people take actions that others can't perfectly observe. So we talk about adverse selection when people are dishonest about their information. We talk about moral hazard when people enter into transactions where they would like to have confidence that the other party in the transaction will do certain efforts correctly, but we have difficulty trusting that you have difficulty trusting I'm going to work hard in preparing my lecture, and I have difficulty trusting that my political leader will actually deliver good governance rather than stealing the public money. Moral hazard has featured a lot in discussions of our banking system in the various waves of financial crises we've seen in the world, and that's another topic for another lecture. But agents of the state, our governments in any country, in any society, the state is a network of agents who hold great power, some of them, and they could profit from abuse of their power. And they have to be motivated, therefore, by an understanding that if providing good governance will have better rewards for the long term than what they could achieve by abusing their power. Agency rents, I've put bold-faced the word agency rents, or moral hazard rents is a term in economics we use for the need to give people rewards, not because they're better or have earned, but because if we don't reward them well, they will be too sorely tempted to abuse their power. So who guarantees that these agency rents will be paid? Ultimately, any political leader who's going to mobilize supporters under any political system to rise to high office and to high power in any society, any political leader needs first and foremost a reputation for reliably rewarding the services of active supporters and agents of his government, his or her government. And the state, of course, must be counted on to protect supporters' rights to these rewards. In some sense, that is the primary, from my perspective, as I try to understand how do societies work as a theorist, as I'm trying to understand how do any of our societies work, mine or yours, I understand the primary imperative in any society throughout history is the state's need, the political leaders need to protect the property rights of those people, those privileged people who are part of his political network. But the big question is, are property rights going to be protected only for a small elite who support the national leader, or does the circle of trust extend to many more or all citizens of the country? Membership in a securely protected group requires some political power. To be a part of that group that the state you can count on the state to protect you to own wealth, that requires that you have some voice, some political power against a leader who fails to protect your rights. So that's a reason why maybe you can understand why that's sometimes why in some societies in the history of humanity, the privileges of protection of the state have been rather narrowly distributed, and the rest of us have needed to get our protection indirectly through networks of patron-client relationships, a very common structure throughout human history in every civilization. But membership in the circle of trust means you can invest in the state. And I think the great miracle of modern economic growth depends more than anything else on the discovery that when a state gives good protection to all of its citizens, the engine of investment throughout the society enriches the whole country so much that the elite have a higher tax base and are ultimately better off. But I want to give you a quote, a really remarkable quote from Adam Smith in his book Wealth of Nations of 1776. It's a longish quote, and I'm sorry that it's in English that I find a bit, well, it's 250-year-old English. But what he's saying, he says, he's talking, let me read from the bottom line. He says, laws and customs that are favorable to yeomanry, that's a word that's gone out of my vocabulary, but I think he means poor, free local people who don't necessarily own very much, but are free citizens of England, that there are laws and customs in England that that are favorable to the status of these peasants and poor citizens, poor local residents, that have contributed more to the present grandeur of England than all of England's boasted regulations of commerce taken together. Let me tell you, we economists have mostly taken from Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations a view to the importance of good regulations of commerce. But he's saying that something else is more important. Now, what is it? He says, a lease, having some lease of not very much value, having a bit of rented land entitles you to vote for Parliament in England in 1776. And as a great part of these peasant farmers have such freeholds, and therefore get to vote for members of Parliament, they become respectable. Now, there is nowhere in England, nowhere in the world, he says, except in England, an instance of a tenant farmer improving his land when he actually only has a lease and trusting that his landlord is not going to raise the rent after he improves the value of the land. And therefore, throughout England, he says that we have these small tenant farmers who are working to make their land more valuable, and they know that the landlord won't raise the rents because they have some legal right to protect themselves against rents being raised against their own improvements. Therefore, they feel secure investing. England is becoming much more productive agriculturally than the lands around it, and that's why we're so rich, and that's why we can send our ships out and conquer the rest of the world. The end. It's an interesting story. It is the status of local people as voters, the decentralized democracy of England that he's saying is a large part of the wealth of England. What the English did send their boats around and managed to colonize and take control of India. Local autonomy without democracy exists in human history, and it's often called feudalism. In early colonial India, the British granted a local feudal powers to a group of people who were called zamindars. These were given as property rights. They could bequeath these powers to their heirs or sell them. They were basically the right to collect taxes and to be responsible for law and order in a collection of villages in rural India. The English did this, by the way, early in the colonial period, and then they reverted to doing it again after the 1857 mutiny. They understood that giving feudal power created a class of local bosses who now had a vested interest in the British colonial regime and were a very effective way of controlling a country. They also understood when the English power was better established, there was a reform movement, and large parts of India didn't have zamindars because the English understood they would get more productivity and ultimately more tax revenue if they'd have a different kinds of political system, giving power to local panchayats, local councils, or giving power to bureaucracies that were based in the provincial council, in the provincial capitals, was better than creating a feudal layer. But when they were afraid of losing power in India, then they understood the power of feudalism. The effectiveness of this feudal power proved remarkably durable. 50 or 60 years after independence, Abhijit Banerjee and Lakshmi Iyer found in their study lower agricultural productivity and higher infant mortality in the parts of India where the British governed through feudal lords, whose feudal powers since 1947 no longer existed, but whose residue persisted. One has to ask how much of poverty in the world, of poor areas of the world, has resulted from such strategies of feudal state building by colonial or other traditional rulers. And this is why I feel the analysis of development is incomplete without a serious consideration of local politics. To give another example, in the 1700s in England, I want to focus on what I think are unappreciated lessons from the British and American histories. In the 1700s, an institution in England called the Turnpike Trusts gave England the world's best transportation network. And this is what they developed good system of roads that had not existed anywhere else in the world before. The McAdams were in the business of building these roads, and the word macadam is now associated with the technology they developed. Later on, under these turnpike trusts, road building technology became more standardized as new inventions for how to build durable paved roads were perfected, and it became possible to build roads anywhere in the world. But I want to argue the building of this road network depended critically on the structure of English government. Why? Because what these turnpike trusts were they were local monopolists. They were toll roads, and there were gates, and who ran them? The people who ran them were the local government. They were the county governments. So the local leaders in the various counties of England were given the rights to erect toll roads, to erect toll booths, if they would maintain better roads. Now, any economist can tell you that if every little bit of road you have a toll road, since people have to travel over many segments of road to get from one place to the other that they want to go to, there's an externality. The high toll in one section reduces demand for other sections, and each section would like to have the highest rate. So you can't do this. So by allowing people to collect tolls, they could raise the funds to maintain the roads, and they would have an incentive to make sure the road actually is passable, even in the rainy season. But if everybody has you need a system of central regulation. If it's not regulated, then every section of the road wants to have a higher toll than the next section, and then no one will travel. So the toll roads had to be managed by the local governments, but they also needed to be regulated nationally. The national government's dependence on local elites in Parliament meant that such local investments could be nationally regulated and yet be secure against central expropriation. The fear is, once we build a nice section of paved road, now the national government will use its regulatory powers to centralize all of the benefits of our local investment. Parliament made it possible to hold local leaders accountable to national law without threatening the system of local privileges, because, of course, the Parliament was an assembly of representatives who were part of their local elites. So with representation in Parliament also, English towns could become secure open markets that attracted investments. I mentioned Poland and Spain as being Spain, well, let me just mention Poland in the 1600s had a very strong system of a national assembly, but their cities were not represented, and I've argued elsewhere that the inability of Polish cities to build make themselves secure marketplaces had something to do with the fact that they had no power in the national system. So when I contrast this toll road system requires giving essential guarantees of property rights to local bosses in the different counties while maintaining a national regulation of that, of those local. You could if you look in contrast at the failure to industrialize in late imperial China. There's an excellent book by the the historian of China, Albert Feuerwerker, in 1958 that I want to recommend as a detailed study of the attempt to begin in China in the late Qing dynasty and from 1860 until 1911 to try to respond to modern technology. And he contrasts Japan as succeeding. I don't know enough of the history of Thai response, but of course everybody in this part of the world was trying to respond to the new technology that the West had, and China, of course, was able to begin developing companies that would have modern shipping, telegraphs, and railroads. These were sponsored by provincial governors in China. Each of these companies typically had a patron in the government at the provincial level. But the imperial government at the national level couldn't restrain itself from expropriating their profits. In 1899, there was a famous trip by the Grand Secretary of the imperial government where he went and audited the accumulated profits in the treasuries of all the various shipping corporations and took it all for the national treasury. The money he was taking was money being taken from companies that were sponsored already by the government, but at lower levels, at the provincial government. Remember, the thesis is property is protected locally, but trade has to be protected nationally. I think it's not often recognized. What brought down the Qing dynasty in 1911? The answer is it was not a popular revolution. It was that the central government attempted to nationalize the railroads. In many countries, railroads are nationally run. They want to take people from one part of the nation to another, and it's quite natural that national law should control the rates, and that the national government should have power over its railroads. But these railroads had been built, there were railroads in China in 1911, but they'd all been sponsored by provincial governors. And when the central government nationalized the railroads, the governors of the provinces lost confidence in the Qing dynasty, and that was that was the downfall of imperial China. Barry Weingast, writing about China, has given the phrase market-preserving federalism, that economic growth requires central leadership, that is strong enough to prevent local bosses from trying to promote local monopolies, but weak enough that the central government cannot violate power sharing deals with local leaders. I think that the great prosperity in China today, the question is why has it been deferred? And I would like to suggest that in the last 40 years, China has been blessed with a government that satisfies these two requirements. It is a strong government, but not too strong. Having a national leader who's very weak. Obviously, there's the period of warlords was a period of civil war and great suffering. But having a central leader who was too strong meant that both in the imperial times and in other times under the communist leadership, there were periods when the central government was too strong, and everyone knew that local profits might be expropriated by the center. There is a balance between local power and national power, which has been solved in a certain way, and is I think, an important part of the success of China today. In general, I'd say when we look at any country, a central question is how are governors chosen? Central appointment a government in any society, to be successful, needs to create a network of trust, of protection and trust that extends from the national leadership down, ideally, to every citizen in the country. Our mayors and our governors are key links in that chain of trust. And as I look from one part of the world to another and try to understand, I think one of the key questions is, are the governors and mayors appointed by the central government, or are they locally elected? Throughout the world, there has been a movement towards local election of governors and mayors, but and this country is I think, has much election, but also a central appointment is also a factor. There's a dual system. There needs to be a balance. Both are needed, but the more you have central appointment, it allows national leaders to use these offices as rewards for their central political supporters, but then you end up with governors and mayors who don't necessarily need local trust in order to retain their offices. So centralization of the profits of local government can weaken the state outside the capital. Robert Bates has a good book about failures of African government, where he outlines states that have I think have chosen this strategy and thereby impoverished their nation. The central government, the person in the presidential palace, uses appointments of local governors as a patronage appointment, but then loses the trust. The United States is trying to support in Afghanistan, has a centralized presidential regime where governors are appointed by the president of the elect who was democratically elected, or at least once democratically elected. The second election was somewhat tainted, perhaps, but he controls. But the governor, although there are locally elected councils in Afghanistan, they don't control the governor. The governor is an appointee of the central government, and in many places is seen to lack trust in ways with local elites in ways that leave an opening for the Taliban opposition. So the alternative is some form of constitutional power sharing with autonomous local leaders, which could be decentralized democracy or feudalism. In a federal system, national leaders' reputations for respecting these local privileges become essential for building strong political coalitions. I want to argue that democratic decentralization gives more people political standing to invest securely in the state, and that, of course, is the point about Adam Smith's yeoman, that local government, where local leaders are elected with democratically as opposed to being local feudal lords, allows not just local corporations to invest securely, but also a much deeper level of investment down to the individual farmer, feeling that it's safe to improve the quality of his fields and that the value of his investment won't be stolen. Let me say, just to carry forward the story from England to America, it was really in the 19th century in England and a little bit earlier in America, late 18th and 19th century, that rights to vote were extended from a small fraction of the population to universal male suffrage and then to universal suffrage in the early 20th century, men and women. Promises of when more people vote, politicians who are competing for votes begin to find that just promising to give away money becomes more expensive, and it's cheaper to promise to provide good public goods, better roads and schools, better enforcement of laws. Public goods and services become a better water supply. Should appeal to a large fraction of voters more effectively than promises of special favors. So an increase in the franchise may, theory suggests, help to motivate our politicians to to make sure that, that our governments provide us with the public goods we need, transportation network, good clean water. But even with free elections, a corrupt leader can retain power if voters believe that all the other candidates would be just as bad. So I've written a theoretical model in which I show how you can have multiple equilibrium democracy, one where the voters expect their leaders to provide good government, and therefore, and if anyone didn't, the voters look for an alternative and vote for another candidate. But there's also an equilibrium where everyone thinks all of those candidates, all of our politicians are going to be very corrupt, and the one we have in power, we know, let's stay with him or her because who knows what the others would do. They talk well, but what would they really do? Successful democracy requires more than just competitive elections. It requires a large supply of candidates who have reputations for using public goods, for using public funds responsibly. Let me say the boldface here. I think that in development economists, in development economics, there's a long tradition of saying we need to increase the national supply of something. What we need is to increase the national supply of steel mills for industrialization, or what we need is to increase the supply of human capital, of education. I want to suggest a different story, and of course all of these stories have some truth, but I want to add a different layer of the theory of development. And that is, we want to increase the national supply of politicians who have good reputations for spending public money responsibly to provide public goods and services. A country where we don't have any politicians with such reputations is obviously a very unfortunate country. A country where we have a leader who is doing a pretty good job is good, but in order to make sure the leader continues to do a good job, we need to know that there's somebody else who's not the leader, who also has done a good job. So we need an excess supply. We need the people in office to know that there's somebody else out of office who also has a history of spending public funds responsibly. That's an economist's view of the question of making democratic elections genuinely competitive for what people really want, which is government that provides better public service. I've so far been talking about the relations between national and local government, and the connection I'm trying to make with this is that when we ask how could a nation increase its supply of politicians who have good reputations for using public resources responsibly, the best answer I can come up with, and this is a theorist, but the question is, does this have real practical application? The best answer I can come up with is responsible local and provincial governments. When municipal and provincial governments are locally elected and have real budgetary responsibility, then you're giving more local autonomous politicians an opportunity to begin developing the same reputations that you hope for from your national leadership. But thereby you hope to make the national government more competitive. Let me say, I claimed that I could give evidence from English and American history. I think it's not sufficiently appreciated. In the history of the United States, the most important fact about the United States of America is that it was a revolution made by 13 separate colonies. When the revolution happened, there were many we now call them patriots because they won, who wanted to make the new government. There were others who we call loyalists, who would have been the patriots if they had won, who actually wanted to stay attached to England. It's not, however we write the history, both views were amply represented in the population. The people who made the revolution were the members of the 13 provincial assemblies. It was a revolution by 13 provincial assemblies. The people in those provincial assemblies had a large part of the power of administering the colonies. The English government was interacting and taking away some of those powers for whatever reasons they thought were appropriate. And no, the provincial assembly said, no, we want 100% of the power, and we're going to make a revolution to have it. So it was a revolution made by 13 provincial assemblies, which formed then above themselves a Congress, a national Congress. So the government started with 2 layers at least, and the members of the provincial assemblies, they were elected by single or 2-member districts. So they were typically representatives of the local leadership in the various towns and counties around the provinces. So the United States was founded with 2 or 3 levels of political leadership that, which under the British imperial system, they had all had to stand for election. So there was a tradition of representative election, and there was a tradition of decentralization of that level of government right from the beginning of the United States. Since then, we've had the central government has become much more powerful. The American Civil War in the 1860s was certainly an important step. The New Deal under Franklin Delano Roosevelt was another stage of the increase in the power of the central government. I want you to know, as you look at America today, and you read awful things about American politics, and that we have our political problems at least as much as any other country I know about. In some sense, the Constitution was designed to create the kind of gridlock between the Congress and the President that has made it very difficult for the United States to make the hard decisions, hard fiscal decisions. And yet, that gridlock that we wouldn't have if we had a parliamentary system, if we had a unicameral parliamentary government, you wouldn't have the kind of breakdown of the inability of the central government to function, has probably been responsible for making sure that the central government didn't overwhelm the 50 separate states. And so the balance of power between the national government and the state governments or provincial governments that exist in the United States, maybe it owes something to the potential for gridlock that we're suffering. But what I really want to say is that the federal democracy meant that the United States from the very beginning was indeed rich in leaders who had reputations for using public resources responsibly, using public resources responsibly for providing public services. So that we did have, under an early president, there was an attempt to ban political dissent. There was I forgot what it was called, but under John Adams, there were laws that were restricting freedom of speech, freedom to criticize the central government. And when those were done, the separate states objected. And there was no way that the central government could overwhelm the separate states because people trusted their provincial politicians as much as more than they trusted national for much of the history. So the argument I'm trying to make, in summary of the second part, is that we might seek better candidates for national, whenever people argue about the appropriate devolution of power from central to provincial and municipal levels. There's a question of, for whatever value of our, however we measure the welfare of our countries, we need our central governments to have the power to provide some important services to our country. We also need local government to be able to provide some powers. What's the optimal level of devolution of power, to decentralization of power? One thing I would argue before saying anything else is that whenever you're in charge at the central level, whoever gets power at the national level has some vested interest in less decentralization. They would rather retain the rights to the patronage rights of those appointments to the valuable positions as rewards for their supporters. So probably decentralization in most countries is not over-provided. The history of the United States means, I've argued, that it began with less of that. Maybe the United States was too decentralized at the beginning because it started from 13 separate colonies. But in most cases, we probably have, if anything, too little decentralization. But to appreciate the advantages of decentralization, most theorists have focused on do do local governments better understand what local people want, and are they more accountable to local voters? Both may be true. There is no question, however, that when a country chooses to devolve more power to its local provincial councils, that we will then see an increase in the amount of corruption by local provincial councils. This, we're not, I don't want to suggest that we should expect any one particular layer of government to be more trustworthy than any other layer of government. We should worry about our corruption in our national governments and in our municipal governments and in our provincial governments. What I do want to argue, that I think has not been sufficiently appreciated, is that when provincial leaders, in a world where there is provincial corruption, when a particular group in a particular province, the leadership of that province is less corrupt than expected, they then get a reward that they can rise to national power, but they also enrich national politics by providing a source of people who have surprised us, who have developed better reputations than we expected. So I want to argue that the performance of democracy in general depends critically on interactions between the different levels of local and national politics. Democracy at higher levels becomes more competitive when challengers can show records of good public service at lower levels. That's the extra benefit that I think has been underappreciated. And the question I would ask is, in Thai politics, I don't know to what extent have there been serious contenders for national leadership who first developed their reputations by providing good public service at the local level. The President of the United States was challenged in the recent election by Mitt Romney, and the President, Barack Obama, we'd seen what he did for 4 years, but Mitt Romney wasn't coming from nowhere. He was someone who had been the governor of Massachusetts, a large state. He spent a large public budget there, and it's considered that he did a pretty good job as governor of Massachusetts. So we got better candidates. Whichever candidate you preferred in America, you were getting a better choice because you knew that the president knew that he would have to run against someone who might have had good credentials from outside. The possibility of democratic advancement, and that's an important word, to higher offices can give officials more incentive to provide good public services. As I look at China today, they now have serious competitive elections at the very lowest level of village or local district in neighborhood in the city. But I would argue that maybe to have what I would call true competitive democracy, it's necessary to have at least two levels. If they have township and county level, then you have in the township, you have local officials who, if they can do a better job, might hope to get advanced up to county level. In every business, especially in politics, advancement, promotion to a higher level is important. If democracy denotes any system in which leaders get greater responsibility when they earn trust and approval from more citizens, but in any system, the boss, an important power of the boss is the power to promote from a lower level to a higher job, which has more rewards and more resources associated with it. If the voters are the bosses in a democracy, the power to promote from a lower level to a higher level is an important power that we want to have. But conversely, local democracy becomes more competitive when different groups in the National Assembly can sponsor alternative local candidates. The data on devolution of power to countries which have had more or less devolution of power to locally elected councils is very ambiguous. I can't claim that there's clear evidence proving that devolution of power causes rise in GDP. If it would, it's going to be a long, slow process because it's through, I'm arguing, through the interaction with the lifetime career reputations of politicians. But I can say that I think there is some evidence that local democracy functions better in countries that already have multiple parties competing at the national level. but certainly that's an important part. So let me conclude by saying I think the value of federal democracy, federal meaning at national and local level, provincial and local levels, I think it's been manifested in the history of the United States. Perhaps part of my point of my talk was to suggest a theoretical perspective of trying to understand this unappreciated aspect of what enabled America to be as developed, to be as strong as it did. But on the other hand, although it's manifested in the history of the United States, it's not always been manifested in American policy. I've mentioned, and I do want to end with this contrast, that the United States, in its policies of promoting a centralized presidential regime in Afghanistan, was failing to appreciate part of the lessons of its own history, the importance of decentralized democratic power as well as national elections. So thank you. Let me end there and say that I look forward to any discussion we can have. Thank you.
If any participants here at UTCC, or let me tell you also that we have live broadcast this event to Burma. If any participant would like to ask any question or share any ideas or experiences, you can come to the central microphone, or if it's not convenient, raise your hand and our staff will bring the microphone to you.
Please.
Yes. Yeah, the one who would like to make a comment, please introduce yourself to the audience.
My name is Poomjai Naksakun. I'm a head researcher at the Bank of Thailand. At the risk of oversimplification, I think what I've gathered from your talk is perhaps that the old federalism debate shouldn't be so much a debate as a matter of balance, so that you have a good quality local autonomy respected by a national federal state. And I think the argument you're saying is that the quality of governance, which is probably better proven at the local level, can then percolate upward, and then you get better quality at the national level. But I was wondering, what if it's, and this is a skeptical point of view, is that what if it's the other way around? What if the quid pro quo sort of corrupted system at the national level actually becomes institutionalized downward? So the direction of this cozy government relationship, that has always existed, perhaps in Thailand at the higher national politics, then become institutionalized at the provincial level. So this is quite contrary, because in Thailand, I do agree that any form of local government, you get a lot better transparency, but it's also possible, perhaps due to some monitoring costs or something, that maybe in Thailand, once you get beyond very small provincial or cooperative states, then you can't really monitor your politician that well. So the risk is not that you get the quality of governance percolating upward, you get the corruption going downstream.
Certainly, there's an argument that's often made, and you've made it, that it's easier for us voters to monitor local performance, and therefore we're going to get better quality government locally. I think, for example, in the United States, in the history of the United States, I think typically voters have had, certainly in my lifetime, qualitatively, I think voters have trusted the national government much more than their state governments. I think so. I would not make the thesis that local government is going to be less corrupt than the national government. And in fact, but it could. But say there are fundamental reasons to hope for that. You were making a very interesting argument that says, supposing we had local governments that, let me back up and say, here I tried to argue, this bullet point right here is saying that there is a very natural, I'm from Chicago where we have a one-party system. I mean, in the city of Chicago, you don't get elected unless you're a Democrat. But I think we have, I think we've had effective government by our mayors in recent years, and and I think I would credit that, even though it's a one-party state, that if the corruption of City Hall were so bad that it was not actually generating the services that people felt they needed, there was no way to prevent the Republican Party. Amazingly, they would be able to come in, and the Republicans would be able to come in and nominate a challenger, and there's no way for the Democrats to prevent the Republican votes from being counted, because there is a multi-party national arena. So I would argue that local politics often becomes dominated by local bosses. Certainly, American history supports that. A lot of cities have had local bosses, not just Chicago, but national competition forces a certain, for instance, the history, the recent history, the Bolivian reforms that I've just read about, the 1990s Bolivia, which was one of the worst governed countries in Latin America, introduced local democracy reforms, and a number of case studies, local bosses, initially local elites established themselves as bosses, but then they could only be associated with one national party, and the other national party then came in and recruited challengers, and ultimately competition forced a certain improvement in government. You suggested a very interesting thesis. We could have a community where they would not have had much corruption, but corrupt national parties come in and force themselves on and that certainly is something we should worry about. How could we reduce the chance of that? I think part of it is precisely if it's not national administration. We could certainly if we have a unitary state where everything is controlled from the center, one can imagine a community where within the community themselves they could handle their public roads and schools well, but then the national leadership, they have choice of two national parties, either one of which is going to send in administrators who will really take most of the money and give it to favorites. The difficulty with that, once this local election, one of the things, if I'm in a corrupt party, I'm a career politician and I belong to a party, how much less corrupt do I want to be than they are? Well, maybe I don't want to be much less corrupt than the national leadership of my party, because otherwise I become a threat to other members of my party, and then I'm not going to get advancement. But if I have the right to be reelected by the voters of my district, then it might be better for me to go against the general corruption of my party and provide better services. So it's important. So I think when a member of a call it corrupt party is the locally elected leader and has the ability to say, I could stand for re-election without and give up my party affiliation. I could jump to a different party, and the citizens in this area know and trust me. Then that becomes a more valuable asset. So in that sense, I'm not afraid I've suggested the value of local democracy being embedded in national politics, in a national political system, not being separate from it. And I think the advantages are probably greater than the disadvantages. And I think you raised a very interesting possibility of a disadvantage. But my answer is I would not worry too much about it, because the ability of the local candidate to run for re-election without his party's sponsorship, if he becomes too clean, if he becomes too good, if he genuinely makes himself popular with the voters, he can run for re-election on that basis. That breaks down if there is lack of transparency in the sharing of funds from the national government to the local government. Then they say you have to elect one of our corrupt cabal or you won't get any central funds. That becomes a problem. So one of the dual sides of democratic decentralization is some transparency in the fiscal relationship between the national and provincial governments. Question? Yeah, please.
Thank you for your very interesting argument, Professor. You seem to suggest otherwise, but from your idea about the agency rents, make me believe that the national government, the federal government, will somehow be more corrupted than the local government. Firstly, as we have discussed before, in the local government, it is easier to make the politicians accountable to the people because of monitoring and that sort of thing. And also your idea about the agency rents means that a local government that can perform well by providing enough public services can be elected and create reputation to a higher level. And by being promoted to a high level, which is the national level, he can gain more agency rents.
Exactly.
Which
But
means
they will bid down the price of the agency rents because he's going to compete by saying, I'll do it for less.
exactly. But once he becomes the national leader, he has a tendency to become more corrupted because there is no higher agency rents. There may be a second term, but then at the end of the term, that's the end of the game.
Yes.
So people think induction backward
Right.
and then become corrupted.
You're absolutely
And it's more difficult to monitor politicians at the national level.
Yes.
So my question is, in this point of view,
Yes.
how can we prevent or reduce corruption at the national level?
Yes.
I offer a few solutions. Firstly, to offset for the opportunity cost of corruption, you have to offer very attractive salary, which may be the case of Singapore. They have very handsome salary for government officials at a high level. Secondly, use the China option. The China option is that they compete fiercely to go to the top of the echelon, as in the case of, they are conducting the National Assembly at the moment. The ones who appears to be performing very well and being clean are promoted. The ones who are considered as corrupted as, for example, Po Si Lai, are dumped.
Yes.
But once they become the national leader, you hear news from the New York Times, people like Wen Jiabao also concealed huge amount of money in terms of his mother salary, shareholding, or that sort of thing. So the Chinese solution, which I believe also may be perhaps the same as the US solution, is that you have clean local government, but then once they are promoted to be national leader, they are corrupted. But decentralization goes far well enough so that the national level government cannot expropriate from the welfare of the local people. That results in certain kinds of equilibrium. The third solution may be it is not enough to have only election, as you seem to suggest, but we need to also have other types of mechanism, for example, transparency, strong
Yes.
media, strong judiciary, that sort of thing. Other check and balance. I would like to hear your response. Thank you.
Thank you. I think you're absolutely. The concept of agency rent I was bolding it because I want to suggest that where there is great opportunity to abuse power, we should not expect to abolish significant rewards, even if these people are no better than the rest of us. I don't know about the salary structure in Singapore government, but I agree. I think, for example, representatives and senators in the United States Congress should be paid much more money, and we would have a higher quality legislature if we would pay them. Start the representatives at $500,000 and the senators at $1 million. Let's say it's ridiculous. Serious, for example, a senior lawyer doesn't want to be in the United States Congress unless he's going to make money on corruption, because he's much better off being a successful attorney and than being an elected member of Congress. I think you've given a very good critique of my hope that by proving their abilities at lower levels, but we should work backwards and say, but when they get to the top, they will turn bad. And that's a very realistic question. I think the ultimate answer that maybe does is what we're hoping that I'd say that the structure of opportunities means there are going to be some inevitable agency rents, but we want them to be the minimal agency rents that we can have consistent with the government providing good service, providing the services, but the government having the funds to provide the services. And ultimately, the ultimate hope for that is that if we haven't reached that least cost of government, that the other party has an incentive to come in and bid for less. How do they make a commitment to actually keep that? Part of the answer is developing a reputation that they can then, so that if we have competition, and not just among people, but among organized factions that are parties, then, and we have to have and we're going to have new elections, then if one party has fought its way in based on some credibility of a promise to do better, but then failed to do better, they should expect to be one term, and then the voters to return to the other the old party will come back. Whereas if you hope to establish that you can do better, that your party will be reelected again. But that requires a bias towards at some point turning out the party that does only just as well as the last one. They promise to do better. How can we hope to get that? I think ultimately there's a question of information. And in that sense, I'm thinking of a model where there are different types. And how do we identify who are the types who are more able to provide an efficient government? My only hope was to give them more opportunities, and that led me to think about local government. But you're absolutely right. It can't be a logical panacea. It can't solve. There's always the possibility that we'll get stuck in an equilibrium where everyone expects that they'll pretend to be good at the local level, but when they get to the national level, then they'll turn bad. As long as they're pretending to be good at the local level, at least we're getting good local government. That was the point of the logical paper where I worked out all the details. I wasn't able to prove we would get good government at the national level or at the provincial level, but I could prove that you couldn't get bad government consistently at both. Because if you did that, and if there was any possibility of somebody who was just a better leader, then the one who could look like he was just a better leader at the local level would then be promoted to the national level, but then all the governors would do it. So either you could get competitive democracy at the lower level. So that was the best I could do in a logical argument. Let me finally say about promotion in China. I think that China has obviously grown phenomenally well. Of course, the people are saving a great deal also, and so the return on investment might not be as good as it, but there's no question that the government of China, the governing elite, the ruling party in China has delivered a growth that is one of the most important events in human history, and the Chinese people should be grateful to their ruling party for very successful development. And I'm trying to understand how it works so well. I'm trying to understand how any system works well, and you've argued that even democracy isn't necessarily. It's hard to understand how democracy can work as well as we hope it would. And it sounds like a very good principle, a non-competitive state where we're going to promote people to national leadership only after they've done a good job of administering at lower levels. The problem with that is that the guys who are responsible at the top level are trying, the factions at the national leadership, there's a lot of secretiveness, so none of us outside of, who, if we're not members of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China, it's very difficult to understand how politics works there. But it's got to work according to some principles that are common to all the rest of humanity, because they're people like the rest of us. And I think they have, it is certainly understandable that there are different factions and different leaders, and what the different factions are trying to do is get a reputation for reliably rewarding political service, not service in building our country, but political service, loyalty. So do I reward you and promote those among you if we're a ruling party in a country and I'm one of the leaders of one of the important factions, I would always like to kind of move things towards those that I will use my power of promotion to promote you, not for building the country, but for being loyally serving me and my career. And so what keeps the standards of promotion based on, yes, you've loyally served me, but you did a bad job of growing the economy or of providing better roads and schools to the people in the district. How do we keep them focused on service? In 1989, there was a very serious challenge to there was a serious political challenge to the authority of the Communist Party. I think the Communist Party in China has done a very good job of governing their country, but I think they're doing a better job. Their ability to fight off becoming a privileged oligarchy where the highest level promotes based on loyalty rather than based on service depended, I think, on something of a political challenge. I think it's difficult, and I think that's a question that needs to be asked, how to maintain the organizational incentive to keep promoting based on public service. But as I try to understand, I'm an American, and Americans believe in democracy. I think people in Thailand have a different history, but a similar deep faith in this same idea. It's an important idea to both of us. There are other countries that are not democratic and have virtues, but I think the principle that leaders should get greater responsibility when they earn trust and approval of citizens, of more citizens, is, I think, shared by the Communist Party of China wants to promote leaders who, but it's because they understand that they need to do so to retain their privileged political position. And if that privileged political position was unchallenged for generations, I think they would have a very difficult time not becoming a group that promotes based on loyalty rather than on service. It's not enough to have ideological training. I think there has to be some mechanism that I would call democracy, but might not look at all like American democracy. Sorry.
One more question.
Now, Thai government is pushing towards more and more local elections, such as the small towns to become municipality. And they also passed by the government, and this is in the parliament. And there's an argument from the political scientists that there must be some criteria, such as the size, the money that can be raised, the knowledgeability of the people who come to represent the local government. The question is that, what is your criteria with the requirement for the local democracy or local administration to be established, the criteria? And another is that the cooperation between the central government and the decentralized governments, such as when disaster, such as the flood comes. Disaster, such as when the flood comes.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Oh.
How can we cooperate that?
Let me say about disaster earlier. One important country to talk about is Pakistan. Pakistan has 3 times had major devolution of power to locally elected councils at the small district and municipal levels, and 3 times they've been undone. Each time it's been military dictators who created local democracy. When national and provincial democracy was restored, Pakistan is a country with only 4 provinces. So there are 2 levels of. Each time when civilian politicians were restored in power at the national and provincial levels, they got rid of the local democracy. This happened most recently. Musharraf gave power back for local elections. The PPP government was installed in 2008, and in summer of 2009, they dissolved the local elected councils that General Musharraf had created under military rule. In January of 2010, there was serious flooding in the Indus River. And there has been, I don't believe will be any study of this, but we can only wonder to what extent the restoration of centrally appointed district magistrates to have responsibility of the government and the dissolution of those locally elected councils must have in some places hindered the disaster relief. That is to say, there may have been, the local councils were at the level of the average local unit was of about 25,000 people in the smallest level of government in Musharraf, what they call a union level of government under General Musharraf. Under Pakistan today, there are only 2 levels of election, members of the Provincial Assembly and members of the National Assembly. These are districts of the order of half a million people in each district approximately. So a community of 10,000 would have been a big deal, would have been to some local official under the old system, the one that was dissolved in January 2000, in the summer of 2009. And I fear that there were some communities that simply got lost because they weren't important enough they didn't have enough political voice. So obviously, disaster relief is an important, it requires coordination of many different groups. But the fear that there will be communities that are suffering and don't have enough political voice to make sure that I'm back up and say one of the very interesting observations, profound observations by Amartya Sen is the question of do famines only never happen under democracies? That when mass parts of the population have starved to death, they were people who weren't voters. No government would tolerate voters starving. Though that a disaster a famine is the worst of disasters, but a flooding disaster is where we get relief. We need to make sure that we're getting public resources out to everybody. Are there going to be, how many people can be, well, one person might be overlooked. Would 1,000 people be overlooked? Would 10,000 people be overlooked? Well, it depends on how important their political voice is, and I think a decentralized political system should have at least as much hope and I would argue that there's some reason to fear that in this specific instance, a political re-centralization may have caused the mortality in the Indus flooding of January 2010 to be greater than it might have been otherwise. You had something else.
What is needed for a local administration to be established?
Let me say,
is needed.
The short answer is of course it's complicated. What public services do we want and what communities? I think the perspective, I want to simply add a different level to it. And one thing that I would argue should be a criterion is that we'd like, which is only one part of what government is about, but when devolution of power creates a ladder of offices. So if you have devolution of power to local councils that represent about 25,000 people each, and then you have 60 million people in your country, well, somebody who does a good job of running a village a local council with 25,000 citizens is not thereby established as a credible contender for prime minister. It's just it's too different. So there's something to be said for somewhere between 20 and 100 units within each level. Now, Singapore is a small country, but the same argument would apply that Singapore, having multiple levels of government, providing a level of Russia is a very large country, and the United States is very large. Thailand is smaller, but my argument is sort of independent of those, that a country should be divided into somewhere between 20 and 100 provinces, each of whose governors could be then a credible contender for national power, and then each of these provinces divided into somewhere between 20 and 100 sub-districts. Now that has nothing to do with the geography and the natural unit that a city, for example, with 10 million people in it, because of its because of commuting across the city, is a natural unit of where you want governance for the entire city to be the most important level. Obviously geography matters, but I would like to add to that the idea that one hopes for multiple levels of government where the ratio of size is such that that we create a ladder of democratic advancement as being one of the advantages of a structure of government that should not be overlooked. Question, yeah. Please.
Thank you, Professor Myerson, for a very inspiring lecture. It's a very touching topic, and especially in Asia. Probably your model works on two tenets. One is the agency rent and the democratic advancement. I wonder whether this model is only applicable in a society like in the United States of America, or is it a global model? Because what we see in Asia, basically, the democratic advancement in certain form is there. And third one, you mentioned the gridlock between the state and the federal government. If it is a parliamentary democracy, that will be less.
Yes.
But contrary to this, what we see the evidence here, like take a case of India. We have a federal government, we have more than 29 states, and we see frequent gridlocks between two.
Yes.
The another problem which happens with this model is, what I believe, looking at your lecture, that it depends on the advanced civil societies when the information asymmetry is less and the people make a rational and reasoned choices to elect their leaders. That is probably the basic tenet of this model. What happened in Asia at large, and particularly I give you an example in India, where even the prime ministers are imposed, they have not done any work in their lifetime. Even the prime minister who are put in the country, they have not done any work at lower level in their lifetime. That's a very unique case.
In India, yes.
So in India, what happens, the federal government, they corrupt leaders, they collude with the local leadership, and they promote those leaders which are, again, similar problem of China and India, that they are loyal to them rather than on any performance basis. So how this model then, the agency rent, because they don't have the incentive as an agency rent. They have the incentive of the loyalty and get more corruption.
Yes.
So this is the problem of the democratic governance in Asian region. It's to a certain extent present in every country, wherever somewhere large, somewhere less. This is one.
Yes.
And the democratic advance does not go from the bottom to up, rather sometimes go up to down. So these are the two issues. Does it incorporate it in your model?
Is it true that no prime minister of India has,
no,
has,
I didn't
has
say
ever
no.
served as a
no,
party
I
chief?
didn't say no. Some of the cases,
Yeah.
he hasn't served anywhere, and he was directly put as the prime minister.
Yeah.
Because he comes from a family
no.
which rules the country for a long time.
Yes.
So if strictly I apply this model, it really doesn't get any support in that.
I'm sorry. So the thesis was,
Yeah.
we're introducing, not that all national politicians should rise up, but so certainly from American history, we have had presidents who were generals first, presidents who were serving in the Senate first, but and then we've had governors come in. So the addition of an alternative channel helps to break down, helps to reduce the possibility that the different factions in the national capital all collude for their mutual benefit, and we say, we'll overlook your corruption. If you'll overlook our corruption, then we'll just take turns, and we'll have these ideological differences that keep half of the electorate voting for one and half the other, but really we'll just share the power back and forth. That's the threat that I'm trying to and to me, I think in American history, part of what has helped to overturn, to limit that effect, has been the possibility of a governor promoting himself separately. He's a member of one of the parties, but he develops a reputation, and then he uses that reputation to guarantee he'll be reelected as governor, make it more likely he'll serve again as governor, but then when he gets a chance, he comes up and thereby enriches national politics. I believe there have been Indian prime ministers who had previously served as chief ministers of a province, but I can't say a name, so I don't know. If there are any, that would be the evidence. Not that all. On the other side, I'm sorry.
No. The key question was this model provide a good basis if you apply like U.S. history.
Yeah.
It's fine. I have not seen in the history what I know about America, any president has been appointed without any experience as a governor.
I certainly don't want to come to Asia and say this is great about America, but not. No, it's that it's a universe. It's a I'm looking for logical structures that can provide an incentive for our leaders to do even better, and I'm looking for some evidence in history. It's only because I can see a logical analysis that I want to observe this aspect of American history that I think, and English political history that I think has been underappreciated, as people ask, what's the secret of their success? What enabled them to become so powerful? And I think that being rich in people in serious political alternatives enabled people in America to demand that much more of their leaders. Not that our politics has achieved any sort of ideal, but it's been better than it would have been otherwise. It's only because it seems like a logical, based on the sort of universal aspect of competing for power. I think if people ask, the most important aspect of any culture, or our cultures have many important aspects, but I want to argue perhaps the most important aspect of our culture in any society is what do we think makes a leader, and what do we demand of our leaders? What do our leaders have to do in order for us to continue to respect their position? Because, by the way, the only reason they're a leader is because it's in game theory terms, it's a coordination game, and we all have to agree. And if we don't agree that you're our leader, then you aren't. So what makes us think that you're our leader, and what could you do that would cost you that recognition? So what do we demand of our leaders? In some sense, I want to argue when there is multi-party political competition, parties, different factions, get in the business of trying to educate the voters. You're not demanding enough of those guys. You should demand more, and we'll give it. Well, of course, sometimes they do that and then don't give it. But and if voters don't expect much, then then democracy is not going to enable them to get much. And maybe I can't stand up and say democracy is a guarantee of good governance. I can only, because certainly I can only ask, how can we design the rules of the game of the politicians have to play to achieve power, to try to increase the probability that we'll get good governance. But ultimately, it requires us to ask more of to try to identify how much can we ask of our elected leaders, and then to demand that our leaders provide it, or else they will lose the recognition. For that, and my argument was only that some devolution of power gives more opportunities for leaders to teach us that we can demand more of them. But clearly, to prevent conflict between political adversaries who control the national and local levels from tearing the government against itself, we need clear boundaries of what each level of government does. And I've said nothing in this theory about what powers are better for national government, what powers are better for local government. I've really tried to argue only that having multiple levels, each of which has budgetary responsibilities that are commensurate with being at this stage of the ladder of democratic advancement are important, because I guess I'm assuming there's a generalized skill at, if you elect me, I'm going to give jobs to my people, I'm going to give a lot of jobs to my cronies, but I am better than the other guy at demanding that my cronies actually provide some public services, and therefore you should elect me. That's the case that I'm hoping our politicians would have an incentive to give, and anything we could do to design a system so they would do that, that would be better.
Okay, one last question.
Thank you very much,
Yes.
Professor Myerson. Sorry, I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Sarawat, and I run a consulting company here. Thank you.
I'd like to make just a quick observation. Here, Christopher Moore is my name. And it's a very interesting thesis you have about really enhancement of legitimacy, of how you create a more legitimate political class. And that's interesting to have a kind of an apprenticeship at the provincial level. And as legitimacy is established there, that becomes a credential at a national level. I can understand that. I think one part that seems a bit incomplete in the theory has to do with the role of security forces, law enforcement, and the judiciary. For example, in Illinois, you will have local judges that are elected. You will have city police in Chicago, which have their own administration, where if you take the UK or you take Thailand, where you have a centralized police force, a centralized judicial system, does that fit into the matrix that you're discussing at a local and provincial level, where in an American system, there is more control over the administration of justice from a law enforcement point of view and from a judicial point of view?
It's clear that in local law enforcement, there, as you say, there are countries that have decentralized police forces, others where it's politically centralized. I think, by the way, probably the most disastrous decision that was made by the NATO mentors of the new government in Afghanistan was to promote a national police force. There are countries that have national police forces, but in a country they require enormous bureaucratic control. Our police have enormous power, and they need to be regulated. So a lot of paperwork is needed if you're going to do, if the only political accountability is in the national capital, and in a country with as low literacy rates as Afghanistan has, it was a disastrous decision, I think, that was probably more responsible for losing the countryside to the Taliban than anything else. If local elites who could have dominated local government would have then had political authority over their own local police forces, they could have organized to protect themselves against when the Taliban were first coming back. So I think in general, allowing some, I think what limited experience I have makes me think that local policing being under control of local elected councils is a good general principle, although there certainly are exceptions. I think they are in countries which have very good educated widespread people with enough widespread education with enough so that your police can be highly educated people who know how to fill out paperwork so that they can be accountable at the higher level. I have to tell you, I'm very aware that the history of the English judicial system was that it was national regulation of a local judiciary. I'm, in some sense, as a theorist, I'm too embedded in history. The justices of the peace are the lowest level of English judicial system traditionally were, I'm talking 1600s, 1700s, were local gentry, but they were regulated by the national level. So again, it was a relationship between national and local elites that was important. I think ultimately, the role of our judiciary in a successful society is a very interesting one. As a fundamental theorist, I marvel at the idea of giving some power to this unelected group. In Illinois, as you've observed, I live in a state, it may not be known to everyone, I live in a state where we elect our judges, and I'm not sure we get better judges as a result of that. Yeah, it's a question. My wife and I work very hard to try to figure out who are the judges we should vote for, but if you have voted in Illinois, you spend a lot of time voting for names you don't know what they are, and they're going to stand up in courtrooms. We create this system. It's a let me just end on this. It's a system of people who who are meant to have very flat incentives. A judge is going to be a respected person, but isn't accountable to anybody. And I think, what do we do with judges? I think the most important thing, they do many things in our societies, but the most important thing that they do, the right of habeas corpus in English common law, was that before the government does something nasty to you, before the government does something nasty for me for breaking the law, they have to at least run it, they have to explain why they're doing it and throwing me in this jail to a judge. And the judge is a completely disinterested person, and he has to have the information. That's an important right, to have somebody who is a privileged position in the government who simply has to be monitoring the use of the state force against its citizens is an important question, is an important innovation. But ultimately, I think the enforcement of law depends on political leadership, that our courts are going to be corrupted by our politicians if the politicians want to subvert the law, and ultimately I think our judicial system cannot substitute for the the faults of our political system. I think I believe building a successful society begins first with some virtue in our political system. As a believer in democracy, I hope to find democratic institutions as improving that, but I cannot claim. But it's obvious from human history that most of human history has not been democratic by the standards of America or Thailand today. And we have had governments that have had some virtue, and our great judicial systems developed under autocratic, authoritarian rule. The English kings are responsible for the development of the English common law that is so much admired, but they were not democrats. So understanding the secrets of successful societies is a very deep one. I have spoken here about issues which this country, I think, is in the middle of, literally, in the sense that this is a country in which democracy has gradually established itself as something very, very deeply in this country. It's been challenged. The idea of leaders being chosen by vote versus leaders being chosen by negotiations among military officers. These are very real alternatives, and I think it's clear in this country that the balance is that the most important thing in choosing the leaders should be approval of broad citizens, even though that doesn't guarantee that we're going to get leaders who all of us like. in any given attribute, and the question of how to make it better. I think the question of decentralization is something that this country is also in the middle of. There is very real political decentralization. Its responsibilities could be increased. I don't know that it should be increased. I wanted to use this occasion to at least raise the question, and I think the judgment I'd like to suggest was that is it possible that if provincial councils are given a larger share of responsibilities, that 10 or 20 or 30 years from now, the choices that voters have at the national level will be in some ways more satisfactory, because some, but not all of them, will be people who had proven themselves by good service at the lower levels. That's a question, and obviously I can't know the answer, but it's a privilege to at least raise the question today.
Okay, I think I will not accept more questions due to the time. So I would like to thank you, Professor Myerson, for his speech. I'm sure you all agree that his talk was very interesting, and also it inspired us to ask ourselves what should be done next step for our country, as also a voter or a citizen who maybe somehow in the future participate in the local election ourselves, some of us. I would like to invite Associate Professor Sawani Thairungrod, President of the University of Thai Chamber of Commerce, to present a small token of our appreciation to Professor Myerson. Our thanks must also be extended to International Peace Foundation, All Bridges event sponsors, Cisco System who broadcast today's events to Myanmar, and definitely to the conference participants who are here today with us at UTCC and in Myanmar. Let me tell you again that starting from today, there will be several continuous run public events for the Bridges series. Events in Thailand until March 2013. The detailed program of all Bridges events is available on the International Peace Foundation's website. It has been fantastic time. I've enjoyed today's speech enormously, and I'm sure you all have. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you again, and see you again here at the next Bridge event. Thank you.